There is a moment in the life of every empire when the masks come off, when the polite fictions that hold a system together begin to crack and the raw machinery of power becomes visible to everyone. For the United States, that moment arrived not with a bang, but with a signature. 9 signatures to be exact. 9 declarations of national emergency signed in the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term. More emergency declarations than any modern president has issued in the same timeframe. More than Obama issued in 8 years. More than Biden issued in 4. But here is what the cable news anchors will not tell you. Here is what gets buried in the fine print beneath the theatrical headlines about border walls and trade wars. Each of those signatures did not just declare an emergency. Each signature unlocked a door. And behind that door sits a warehouse of powers that most Americans have never heard of and would be terrified to know exist. 150 statutory authorities, to be exact, catalogued by the Brennan Center for Justice after years of painstaking research through the forgotten corners of American law. Powers that allow a president to seize communications networks, to freeze bank accounts, to deploy military forces on domestic soil, to bypass Congress entirely and rule, for all practical purposes, by decree. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the legal architecture of the American presidency, built quietly over decades, tested occasionally, but never deployed at this scale, with this velocity, for purposes this far removed from what anyone would call an actual emergency. And this week, something remarkable happened. Something that should have been impossible in an era of tribal partisan warfare. Republicans in the United States Senate looked at what their own president was doing and said no. 5 Republican senators stood in front of their colleagues and voted to strip Donald Trump of his claimed authority to wage war in Venezuela without congressional approval. 12 Republican senators voted in 2019 to block his first border emergency. 3 Republicans joined Democrats to terminate his tariff emergency declarations. Not enough to override a veto, not enough to stop the machine, but enough to send a signal that even inside the fortress of Republican loyalty, the walls are beginning to crack. Because what we are witnessing is not normal. What we are witnessing is the systematic conversion of emergency powers designed for wars and pandemics and genuine existential threats into a general-purpose toolkit for achieving domestic policy goals that Congress has explicitly refused to fund. We are witnessing the hollowing out of the separation of powers. We are witnessing the birth of what constitutional scholars are now calling, in increasingly alarmed tones, an imperial presidency on steroids. And the most dangerous part is not what is happening. The most dangerous part is that it is working. To understand what is at stake, you have to understand how emergency powers actually work in America. Most people assume that if a president declares a national emergency, the Constitution grants him some vague, temporary authority to act decisively. That is the Hollywood version. The reality is far more specific and far more terrifying. The National Emergencies Act, passed in 1976, was supposed to be a reform. Before that law, the United States had been operating under a patchwork of emergency authorities declared as far back as the Korean War and never terminated. President Nixon, facing scrutiny from Congress during the Vietnam War era, had access to hundreds of emergency powers with no oversight, no time limits, no checks. The National Emergencies Act was meant to fix that. It was meant to force presidents to specify which powers they were invoking, to report to Congress regularly, and to give Congress a mechanism to terminate emergencies that had outlived their usefulness. Here is what actually happened. The law gave presidents a menu. 150 statutory authorities become available the moment a president signs a national emergency declaration. Some of them are mundane, emergency procurement procedures, faster permitting for disaster response. But buried in that list are powers that read like a tyrant's wish list. The President can, during a declared emergency, suspend environmental regulations, impose economic sanctions on entire countries, regulate international financial transactions, take control of communications networks, seize private property through eminent domain, and, most critically, redirect military construction funds to projects that Congress explicitly refused to authorise. This is the power that Trump used in 2019 to build his border wall after Congress denied him the money. This is the power he has invoked again in 2025, reinstating that border emergency on his first day back in office. And this time, he is not stopping with the border. This time, he has declared a national energy emergency, a national emergency over trade deficits, an emergency targeting drug cartels, an emergency over cybersecurity, an emergency to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, and eventually dozens of other countries. 8 emergencies in his first 100 days. 11 active emergencies that carry his signature. No president in modern history has moved this fast or reached this far. And the legal framework that is supposed to constrain him has proven to be almost entirely toothless. Here is the trap that Congress built for itself. The National Emergencies Act allows Congress to terminate an emergency by passing a joint resolution. Sounds reasonable, right? Except that joint resolution has to be signed by the President, the same President whose emergency you are trying to terminate. If he vetoes it, and he will, you need a 2/3 supermajority in both chambers to override him. In practice, that means that once a president declares an emergency, he can keep it going indefinitely unless his own party turns against him in overwhelming numbers. Trump tested this in 2019. Both the House and the Senate, in a bipartisan vote, passed a resolution to terminate his border emergency. Trump vetoed it. It was his first veto. And despite 12 Republican senators voting against him, there were not enough votes to override. The emergency continued. The wall got built with money that Congress explicitly said could not be used for that purpose. And the precedent was set. This is what Elizabeth Goitein of the Brennan Center calls the problem of emergency powers in a nutshell. Presidents can declare them with nothing more than a signature. They can renew them every year, forever. And Congress is effectively powerless to stop them unless the president voluntarily agrees to give up his own power. The framers of the Constitution built an elaborate system of checks and balances to prevent executive overreach. The National Emergencies Act creates a backdoor around all of it. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump walked into the Oval Office for the second time and got to work. Within hours, he had signed Proclamation 10886, reinstating the national emergency at the southern border that Biden had terminated in 2021. The proclamation cited the need to use armed forces and declared that military construction funds could be redirected to build the border barrier. It was a shot across the bow, a signal that this term would not be constrained by the same political calculations that had slowed him down before. That same day, he signed Executive Order 14156, declaring a national energy emergency. Not a regional shortage like the energy crises of the 1970s. A national emergency covering the entire domestic energy supply, citing inadequate production as a threat to national security. The order directed federal agencies to fast-track fossil fuel projects, to invoke emergency provisions of the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act, and to explore the use of the Defence Production Act and federal eminent domain to seize land for energy infrastructure. It was the first time any president had ever declared a national energy emergency. Critics pointed out that the United States is currently the largest oil producer on the planet. The emergency, they said, was not about supply. It was about bypassing environmental regulations to accelerate drilling. He also signed Executive Order 14157, designating Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations under emergency authority. This unlocked an entirely different set of powers, allowing the Treasury Department to freeze assets and impose sanctions not just on cartels, but on anyone deemed to be supporting them, a definition elastic enough to potentially target political opponents in Latin America. By February, the emergency declarations were coming faster. Trump declared an emergency at the northern border with Canada, focused on drug trafficking. He issued executive orders imposing tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, citing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which allows the president to regulate commerce during a declared emergency involving unusual and extraordinary threats. The justification was fentanyl and illegal immigration. The mechanism was emergency powers originally designed for wartime sanctions. Then came April 2, 2025, Liberation Day. Trump stood in the Rose Garden and declared a national emergency over the United States trade deficit, a deficit that has existed for decades. He invoked emergency powers to impose a baseline 10% tariff on almost every country in the world, with country-specific tariffs ranging up to 41%, depending on a formula his administration claimed measured reciprocal trade barriers. Economists immediately pointed out that the formula was overly simplistic and bore little relationship to actual trade practices. The trade deficit, they noted, is not a crisis. It is a feature of a wealthy consumer economy. But the emergency was declared, the tariffs were imposed, and the global economy convulsed. By June, legal scholars were sounding alarms. Trump had invoked emergency powers more times in his first 100 days than any other modern president in the same period. And critically, he was not using these powers for the kinds of crises that emergency laws were designed to address. He was using them to implement his domestic policy agenda faster than Congress would allow. Kim Lane Shepley, a professor at Princeton who studies emergency powers, put it bluntly, "This is pedal to the metal on executive power. The goal is to get a case to the Supreme Court that will give the president unlimited power." This is not hyperbole. Trump himself has said as much. In private conversations with Republican senators, he has made clear that he believes the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. He has argued that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act gives him virtually unlimited authority to regulate commerce. He has told allies that the courts will side with him, that the Supreme Court's conservative majority will bless his interpretation of executive authority, and that once that precedent is set, the constraints that have governed American presidents for generations will be gone. And that is when the cracks started to show. Not among Democrats, who were expected to oppose him, among Republicans, among senators who had spent years defending Trump against impeachment, against investigations, against media attacks. Senators who owed their political survival to staying in Trump's good graces. Even they were beginning to realise that something had gone too far. It started with Rand Paul of Kentucky. Paul has always been a libertarian outlier, sceptical of executive power regardless of who wields it. When Trump imposed tariffs using emergency authority, Paul was immediate and unequivocal. Our Constitution does not allow any one man or woman to raise taxes. It must be the body of Congress. He co-sponsored resolutions to terminate the tariff emergencies. He voted against his own party. And he took the heat. Then came Susan Collins of Maine. Collins is facing a tough re-election in 2026 in a state that Biden won. She is under enormous pressure from her constituents, many of whom are furious about the tariffs and their impact on businesses that depend on imports from Canada. But her opposition went deeper than politics. When Trump began talking about putting boots on the ground in Venezuela, about the United States running Venezuela, Collins was one of 5 Republicans who voted to invoke the War Powers Resolution, requiring Trump to seek congressional approval before further military action. Her statement was measured but firm. "I believe invoking the War Powers Act at this moment is necessary, given the president's comments about the possibility of boots on the ground and a sustained engagement running Venezuela, with which I do not agree." Lisa Murkowski of Alaska joined her, Todd Young of Indiana, Josh Hawley of Missouri, who had been one of Trump's most vocal defenders during the 2020 election challenges. All 5 voted with Democrats to advance the War Powers Resolution. The vote was 52 to 47, a majority. Not enough to override a veto, but enough to send a message that even Trump's own party was beginning to balk. Trump's response was swift and brutal. Hours after the vote, he got on the phone with each of the 5 senators. The calls were described by people familiar with them as angry. In at least one case, with Susan Collins, Trump raised his voice and sharply criticised her. He threatened primary challenges. He told them they should never be elected to office again. He posted on Truth Social that their vote greatly hampers American self-defense and national security, impeding the president's authority as commander-in-chief. But the genie was out of the bottle. Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who had previously opposed Trump's border emergency in 2019, said publicly that he would encourage the people around the president to understand what is at stake in this election. Mitch McConnell, who had been one of Trump's most reliable allies in the Senate, did not vote on the tariff resolution, but told colleagues privately that he had concerns about the precedent being set. Even senators who ultimately voted with Trump admitted in interviews that they were uncomfortable with the scale and speed of his emergency declarations. The tariff votes were even more revealing. 3 times in 2025, the Senate voted to terminate Trump's tariff emergencies. Once for Canada, once for Brazil, once for the Global Liberation Day tariffs. Each time, a handful of Republicans broke ranks. Not enough to override a veto, but enough to show that the unanimous support Trump once commanded was fracturing. The Brazil vote was particularly telling. Trump had declared an emergency and imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, not because of trade practices, but because he was unhappy with Brazil's prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right former president and Trump ally who had been sentenced to 27 years in prison for attempting a coup. The emergency, in other words, was purely political. Tom Tillis voted to terminate it. "I just don't think there is a rational basis for it," he said. Each of these votes has been largely symbolic. Speaker Mike Johnson installed a special rule in the House to block termination resolutions from reaching the floor. Even if they somehow passed both chambers, Trump would veto them. The procedural hurdles are designed to make it nearly impossible for Congress to check presidential emergency powers. But symbols matter. Precedent matters. And what these votes represent is a slow, grudging acknowledgement from at least a faction of the Republican Party that what Trump is doing is not normal, not legal, and not sustainable. While the constitutional scholars debate separation of powers and the senators navigate their political survival, the real world is paying the price. The tariffs, justified by emergency declarations, are not theoretical exercises in executive authority. They are taxes. Taxes paid by American businesses. Taxes passed on to American consumers. And the economic data is beginning to paint a portrait of a country inflicting wounds on itself in the name of strength. The Tax Foundation calculated that Trump's tariffs, if sustained at their current levels, will raise the average tax burden on American households by $1,100 in 2025 and $1,500 in 2026. For a middle-class family, that is the equivalent of a significant pay cut. But the impact is not evenly distributed. Small businesses that rely on imports have been crushed. A typical small importer faced more than $90,000 in tariff costs from April to July alone. Revenue losses averaged 13%, which will annualise to $100,000 if the tariffs remain in place. Consumer spending, the engine of the American economy, has slowed to half its 2024 rate. The Producer Price Index, which measures costs before they reach consumers, jumped by 0.9% in a single month in July 2025, the biggest increase in more than 3 years. Housing construction has stalled as tariffs drive up the cost of materials. Trucking and logistics companies have announced mass layoffs, citing weak demand and uncertainty. More than 4,000 jobs in freight-related industries were cut in recent weeks alone. California, the largest state economy, has borne the brunt. California firms incurred $11.3 billion in tariff costs from January through May 2025, the highest of any state. The Yale Budget Lab estimated that tariffs will cost the average household an additional $2,400 in 2025. These are not projections. These are costs already being paid. And then there is the chaos. The Trump turbulence tax, as some economists have started calling it, the cost imposed not just by the tariffs themselves, but by the constant uncertainty, the abrupt reversals, the deals announced and then delayed, the exemptions granted and then revoked. On Liberation Day, Trump declared tariffs on almost every country. Then he delayed them for 90 days. Then he delayed them again. Then he imposed them on some countries but not others. Then he announced deals that turned out to be temporary truces. Businesses trying to plan supply chains, trying to set prices, trying to manage inventory have been left in a state of paralysis. Do you stockpile? Do you pass costs on to consumers? Do you wait and hope the tariffs get reversed? Each decision is a gamble, and every gamble comes with a cost. JP Morgan warned that the United States is heading toward recession. They downgraded global growth forecasts across the board. The International Monetary Fund issued statements urging restraint. Even Trump's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, a hedge fund manager who understands leverage and risk, has reportedly expressed private concerns about the sustainability of the strategy. Bessent understands what Trump does not seem to grasp. When you owe the world's reserve currency and you start behaving like a rogue state, using emergency powers to shake down your own allies, the world starts looking for exits. China and the BRICS nations are watching this and taking notes. They are accelerating their plans for alternative payment systems. They are moving trade out of dollars and into local currencies. They are proving in real time that you do not need Washington's permission to conduct commerce. Every emergency declaration, every arbitrary tariff, every threat issued via Truth Social at 3 a.m. is ammunition for Beijing's argument that American hegemony is not just declining, but actively self-destructing. While the economic damage mounts and the political rebellion simmers, the ultimate fight is taking place in the courts. Because if Trump's emergency powers are upheld by the Supreme Court, this will not be a temporary aberration. It will be the new normal. It will be a green light for every future president, Democrat or Republican, to bypass Congress whenever it suits them. It will be the death of the legislative branch as a meaningful check on executive power. The first major case reached the United States Court of International Trade in May 2025. The plaintiff was a company called Learning Resources, an Illinois-based educational toy manufacturer that depends on imports for its supply chain. They argued that Trump had exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act by using it to impose tariffs. The law, they said, allows the president to regulate economic transactions during emergencies involving unusual and extraordinary threats. But a trade deficit that has existed for decades is not unusual. It is not extraordinary. And it is certainly not a threat in any meaningful sense of the word. On May 28th, the court agreed. In a stunning ruling, the judge held that Trump had overstepped his authority and ordered the Liberation Day tariffs vacated. Days later, a district court in Washington went even further, holding that the IEEPA does not authorize tariffs at all. The law, the judge wrote, was designed for sanctions, for freezing assets, for targeting specific bad actors during crises. It was never meant to be a blank check for rewriting trade policy. Trump's Justice Department immediately appealed. The tariffs remained in place while the appeals process ground forward. By August, the case had reached the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which consolidated multiple challenges into a single case. The stakes could not be higher. If the court rules against Trump, roughly 61% of the tariff increases he has imposed would be declared illegal. The administration could be forced to refund billions of dollars already collected. The entire emergency tariff regime would collapse. But Trump is betting on the Supreme Court. Oral arguments are scheduled for November 5th, 2025. The court's conservative majority, shaped by Trump's own appointments, will decide whether a president can declare a national emergency over anything he deems a threat, and use that declaration to wield powers that Congress has never explicitly authorized. Legal scholars are divided. Some argue that the law is clear, that Congress intended emergency powers for genuine crises, not policy disagreements. Others point out that the National Emergencies Act is deliberately vague, that it leaves enormous discretion to the President, and that the courts have historically been reluctant to second-guess executive determinations of what constitutes an emergency. Elizabeth Goitein warns that if the court sides with Trump, the implications will be profound. It will mean that a president can, at any time, for any reason, declare an emergency and unlock a toolkit of powers that were never meant to be used this way. It will mean that the separation of powers, the foundational principle of American government, has been replaced by a system where the executive can legislate by decree as long as he invokes the magic words national emergency. Kim Lane Shepley of Princeton is even more blunt. The point is to get the case to the Supreme Court when he thinks he has got a majority, to give him unlimited power. If that happens, she says, the American constitutional system as we have known it will be fundamentally altered. And this is where the story gets even more complicated. Because the dirty secret that no one in Washington wants to say out loud is that Trump did not invent this playbook. He is just executing it more aggressively, more brazenly, with less pretense than any of his predecessors. Every modern president has stretched emergency powers. George W. Bush declared 14 national emergencies. Barack Obama declared 12. Joe Biden declared 11. Most of them targeted foreign entities, imposed sanctions, froze assets. None of them used emergency powers the way Trump is using them, to impose sweeping domestic economic policies. But the legal architecture was already there. The precedents were already set. Trump is not building a new tool. He is picking up a hammer that previous presidents left on the table and swinging it harder than anyone thought possible. This creates a trap for Democrats. If they argue that Trump's emergency declarations are illegitimate, that he is abusing powers never meant for this purpose, they are implicitly arguing that the National Emergencies Act needs to be reformed. But reforming it means limiting presidential power. And the next time a Democrat is in the White House, they might want that power. They might want to declare a national emergency over climate change, or gun violence, or wealth inequality, and bypass a Republican Congress that refuses to act. Some Democrats have already floated this idea. Nancy Pelosi, back in 2019, warned Republicans that Trump's border emergency would set a precedent for a Democratic president to declare a gun violence emergency. The logic is tempting. If Trump can call a trade deficit an emergency, why can't a Democrat call 30,000 gun deaths a year an emergency? If Trump can redirect military funds to build a wall, why can't a Democrat redirect funds to build green energy infrastructure? But constitutional scholars across the political spectrum are sounding alarms. This is the road to authoritarianism, they warn. Not the Hollywood version with jackboots and midnight raids. The slow, procedural version where power accretes to the executive, where Congress becomes a ceremonial body, where emergency becomes the new normal. We are watching the erosion of democratic norms in real time, and once those norms are gone, they are almost impossible to restore. The reform efforts are there, but they are fragile. In 2019, after Trump's first border emergency, there was broad bipartisan support for reforming the National Emergencies Act. Senators from both parties agreed that Congress needed a better mechanism to check presidential power, that the two-thirds override requirement made termination effectively impossible. Bills were introduced, hearings were held, and then nothing happened. The political will evaporated. Trump left office, Biden came in and terminated the border emergency. The crisis passed and the reforms died. Now, in 2025, similar efforts are underway. House Republicans have introduced legislation requiring significant executive orders to receive congressional approval before taking effect. It is going nowhere. Senate Democrats have introduced resolutions to reform emergency procedures. They are symbolic. The truth is that neither party wants to give up the power when it is their turn to wield it. Both sides are gambling that they will be in the White House when the rules finally collapse. Both sides are playing chicken with the Constitution. So here we are, January 2026. Donald Trump has declared 11 active national emergencies. He has imposed tariffs on virtually every trading partner. He has redirected billions in military construction funds. He has invoked emergency powers to fast-track energy projects, to sanction cartels, to deploy military resources at the border. He has done all of this with the stroke of a pen, with minimal congressional input, with legal authority that is either breathtakingly broad or wildly illegal, depending on which lawyer you ask. 5 Republican senators have stood up and said no. Not enough to stop him, but enough to matter. The courts have issued preliminary rulings against him, but those rulings are on hold pending appeal. The Supreme Court will decide in the coming months whether the American presidency is still constrained by law or whether emergency powers have become a general-purpose override switch for the separation of powers. And while all of this plays out in courtrooms and committee hearings, the real world is bleeding. Small businesses are closing. Families are paying more for everything. Jobs are disappearing. Global markets are convulsing. America's allies are reconsidering their alliances. America's adversaries are seizing the opportunity. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, the foundation of American economic power for 80 years, is being tested in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. This is not a partisan story. This is not about whether you support Trump's policies or oppose them. This is about whether the United States will remain a constitutional republic with meaningful checks on executive power, or whether we are witnessing the birth of something different. Something where the president, any president, can declare an emergency whenever it is politically convenient and govern by decree. Something where Congress is reduced to a rubber stamp, the courts are intimidated into deference, and the only real check on power is the willingness of a handful of senators to risk their careers by saying no. The founders designed a system where ambition would check ambition, where power would be diffused, where no single person could bend the entire government to their will. The National Emergencies Act, well-intentioned as it may have been, has become a backdoor around all of that, and Trump is walking through that door with the confidence of someone who knows the Supreme Court might just lock it open behind him. The question now is whether anyone can stop him, whether the courts will hold, whether the Republican rebellion will grow, whether the economic pain will become unbearable enough to force a political reckoning, whether the American people will wake up to what is happening before the precedent is set, before the damage is permanent, before the separation of powers becomes a quaint idea that we used to believe in, back when America was a democracy. We are living through a constitutional stress test, and right now, the Constitution is failing. If you found this video valuable, if you think this story needs to be told, hit that like button. Share this with someone who still believes the system works the way they were taught in school. Subscribe to this channel because this story is not over. The Supreme Court arguments are coming. The economic consequences are mounting. The political battle is intensifying. And we will be here tracking every development, connecting every dot, telling you what is really happening while the mainstream media focuses on the spectacle and ignores the structure. The emergency is not what Trump says it is. The emergency is what he is doing. And time is running out to stop it.